Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. And I hope everybody's still awake, but how could you help but be? Everything's been so interesting, and it's all new stuff, and we're all learning. So here we go. Deep limits hard structures and the Coastal Management Act, implications for shoreline hardening, we're going to talk about. In general terms, shoreline hardening is erosion control practices using hard or permanent structures and used with the intent to armor or stabilize the coast. Well, you may wonder, why would anyone want to armor or stabilize the coast? Well, it just goes back to all the uses that have happened over the years before there was regulation, before people understood the need to preserve coastal resources and how important they are. There's a big range, I should say, of shoreline hardening. Everything from someone observes some sort of erosion at the toe of their slope and says, oh gosh, I should do something. And some people did a lot. And believe it or not, a lot of the things you see out there, you go, I can't believe DEEP would authorize that. But a lot of these things were put up prior to our permitting, and even in some cases with permitting, and I'll talk about that. The statutory definition for shoreline flood and erosion control structures are any structure, the purpose or effect of which is to control flooding or erosion, and includes the placement of concrete, rocks, or other significant barriers to water or the movement of sediments. And this, in the statute, these structures are defined, these are structures that I'm about to talk about that are considered flood and erosion control structures. A breakwater in Groton, this is off of Spicer's Marina. A bulkhead in Groton also. This is a groin in Clinton, many groins in Clinton. A jetty, which is basically a groin at the mouth of a channel to stop sand from going into the channel. Usually, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. A revetment, riprap, seawalls, and the structures along the coast began to be regulated in 1939 in response to the 1938 hurricane. And we have drawers and drawers full of permits of people that came in and asked for permission to do work in our jurisdiction, which at that point was mean high water. And there's docks and bulkheads and a lot of things. There was also lots of bulkheads that people asked to put out in the water and fill behind it and make land. Something we wouldn't allow today, but there are a lot of structures out there that really don't comport with our standards of today, but they were permitted. And then in 1969, the Tidal Wetlands Act was enacted in response to the fact that over the 90 years before that, at least, about 30% of all the wetlands at that point had been filled. And the reasons, I should say, that a lot of that was done was to create buildable land. People didn't perceive or understand the great value that wetlands have as a nursery for juvenile organisms and flood retention or mitigation. And there's just so many, now we understand why tidal wetlands are important, but up till that point, they were just perceived as a barrier to development and mosquito breeding habitat. So then in 1980, the Coastal Management Act was enacted. And what that does is it's a very important document because it's the foundation for all the decisions that we make according to the permits. All of our decisions have to be made consistent with that. The purpose is to guide planning, development, acquisition, and regulatory activities, and to provide a uniform standards and criteria for all public agencies, local, state, and federal. They all have to, all their activities in the coastal boundary have to be in conformance with the Act. And the Coastal Management Act defines adverse impacts to consider, and it defines the coastal resources and has a set of specific enforceable policies pertaining to each of the resources. And projects are evaluated for consistency with the coastal policies and adverse impacts, and we have to try to mitigate those. How does the Coastal Management Act apply to shoreline hardening? They better not get any closer to the top of slope there. The regulatory process, because of significant potential impact to coastal resources, there's a high threshold for permit approval of any new flood and erosion control structures. For example, if someone perceives that their beach is being eroded and they want to get more sand on their beach, they may want to have a groin. But if you put a groin out, it may adversely impact the people next door. So we usually require some sort of a study be done by an engineer to determine what is the appropriate structure to be located, if any structure, at that site. And the Coastal Management Act specifies the eligibility criteria, of which I will talk about next, and the applicant must meet all of these criteria. The structural solutions to erosion control problems are permissible only when unavoidable and necessary to protect certain features, which I'll talk about next, and there's no feasible, less environmentally damaging alternative available, and all reasonable mitigation measures and techniques have been provided to minimize adverse environmental impacts. For instance, if somebody can justify putting in groins, for example, or even rebuilding ones that have been there, we still are allowed under the law to have somebody modify a groin that's been there for a while to make it less impacting the environment. For example, by making it shorter or lower, or put in sand. Those are mitigation measures. So there's 4 circumstances where structural solutions to erosion control problems can be allowed. One is infrastructure, like bridges, roads, utilities. In this case, this would be riprap at the base of the abutments and the side slopes of the road approach. Recently, we also expanded this definition to allow structural solutions to protect cemetery or burial grounds. This particular cemetery in Stonington, this is really in response to this one, erosion was coming perilously close to graves, and we couldn't have that. And in this case, there was no other non-structural solution that was really available. Whoops, did I go too fast there? Water-dependent uses, we do allow structural solutions, such as a marina, yacht club, a power plant that uses water for processing, and in this case, a lobstering facility. And then pre-95 inhabited structures. Today, we would not recommend that someone put a house this low, this close to the water, but nonetheless, there are many, many houses in Connecticut that are there. And that would be one circumstance where we could allow some sort of structural solution. It isn't always feasible to relocate a house or raise it. So in 2012, this public act was got through the legislature, which to more clearly define and encourage implementation of living shorelines. So it specifically excluded living shorelines from those 4 criteria. And that's really for the purpose of encouraging living shorelines, because for example, before somebody might want to do something that was now considered a living shoreline, maybe a sill to prevent erosion at a marina where there was a lot of boat wake, but we just couldn't do it because of the statutes. And the statutes were, the reason that this was all included in the Coastal Management Act was because we had come to realize through permitting, through experience and education, that structural solutions often cause more problems. Well, they can cause many problems, and they're not always the solution to protecting people's property. So what the regulatory impact of that public act is that it exempts structural components, such as like sills, for example, of living shoreline projects from the strict eligibility thresholds that I just discussed. And it provides some regulatory flexibility to consider a wider range of living shoreline projects, and some of which may be eligible for a COP and not a full permit. And then we have to be very careful of what we call a living shoreline. And I think you can't just throw any kind of structural solution and call it a living shoreline, because then those policies wouldn't apply, and there could be adverse impacts to the environment because of it. So the Coastal Management Act in practice, the applicant's responsibility in the case of being a permit applicant is to, they have the burden of proof in the application process to demonstrate they're consistent with all the policies in the Coastal Management Act that apply to their site, and then DEEP evaluates whether they really are consistent. And then we work with the applicant to minimize any adverse impacts and to come up with a proposal that is consistent with all the statutes and hopefully delivers what the applicant would like. So what are the relevant policies that DEEP staff must consider? These are people that are in this room today. See if you can figure out who they are. Well, there's somebody there who likes Syracuse. I won't say who. I can't say that at UConn, sorry. Anyway, one of the policies is to maintain the natural patterns of erosion and deposition and longshore transport and onshore, offshore movement of sand. So in this case, there's a beach. To maintain the natural relationship between eroding and depositional landforms and to minimize the impacts of erosion and sedimentation on coastal land uses. Here's a site where there's a coastal, a tidal creek that has a natural beach and a dune behind it. Along the shore, the way that the Connecticut shore evolved is that there's a beach, in many cases, a beach, a dune, and then a wetland and a lagoon. Unfortunately, what happened along the Connecticut coast is when people started to have more disposable income around the turn of the 1900s, and little cottages got built, people thought, oh, the weather's nice, I want to be close to the water. The dune is up high, let's put our cottage in the dune. And unfortunately, when you get rid of the dune, you get rid of the protection that the dune can offer if you had put your house behind the dune, if you have to put it that close to the water. Another policy is that we have to protect bluffs and escarpments. And there's many bluffs and escarpments that have been modified because people don't really understand that they're glacial, they contain glacial material that can help feed the beaches, and people didn't really like to see them eroding. So what our policy is to manage coastal bluffs and escarpments so as to preserve their slope and to disapprove uses that accelerate slope erosion and that alter the essential patterns and supply of sediments to the littoral transport system. So basically all of these policies have to do with making sure the normal processes keep flowing, basically, and that you don't stop that by armoring them. Here's actually a bluff that hasn't been altered. If you saw the rest of the picture over to the west part, that somebody had altered it and had to take it out under our enforcement program. Beach systems, including dunes and beaches. The policy is to preserve the dynamic form and integrity of natural beach systems to provide critical wildlife habitat, reservoir for sand supply, and a buffer for flooding and erosion, and of course recreational opportunities. This is a beach where the ideal situation is even with big waves or a big storm, the waves will come in, the energy will dissipate gradually over the face of the beach, and you won't get erosion. And here's an example of a place where a dune is actually allowed to still survive, and it provides a source of sand to the beach and also protection of the houses landward of it. So we want to protect all these shoreline processes to ensure that coastal uses are compatible with the capabilities of the system and don't unreasonably interfere with the natural processes of erosion and sedimentation. I think it's human nature. People like to see things stay as they were. They don't understand that the coast is so dynamic. It's an education thing too, but I think sometimes people freak out after the winter when this beach gets steep and they want to do something, and I usually just tell them, why don't you wait and see what happens, and then the normal summer patterns come and the beach comes back. So there's a flow that people that live on the coast really have to understand and maybe be more tolerant of and accepting of. Here is an example of a groin field where the littoral transport has been altered. In this case, it's not as bad as some groin fields because most people here get a little bit of of sand. And this is probably why somebody might want a groin, because they think this will happen. But groins don't magically attract like a magnet sand. They can only alter the actual processes of the sand that's in the system. So what happens is whatever direction is the predominant wind and wave pattern, the sand accumulates in the corner of the groin and can starve the other downstream or part of the other side of the groin, and can in this case probably the groins are lower, which is what we usually suggest now, where groins are allowed to be built or where they're modified when they want to repair them, would be lower groins and shorter groins. And then that would also allow people to pass along the beach waterward of mean high, which is public trust land. Some of the groins out there are so high because they were built without engineering prior to our standards being raised that you'd need a pole vaulter to get over them. And it's just not appropriate to block people's access to the shore like that. But sometimes groins really, really starve the down gradient side. This is our favorite Old Saybrook, Western Old Saybrook. And this is a terrible situation because these people that are to the west of that large groin, which is there, their houses are imperiled. Their seawalls are undermining. The seawalls that were installed above our jurisdiction, above mean high water, before 1987 when our jurisdiction changed, now they're in our jurisdiction. And it's all because of the erosion of a groin that was poorly designed. The effects of walls on beaches, when people, like I was saying, would say, I'm going to put my house on a dune. And everything's fine for a while until they notice a little erosion at the toe of it. And then they say, oh dear, I better put a wall up. And what happens then is the force of the water comes in the force of the wave. And instead of having a nice beach to gradually dissipate the energy over, it hits the vertical face of the seawall, projects the energy down at the toe and up over the wall to hit the house, and then what's projected at the toe actually, in many cases, undermines the wall and causes failure. Now by this time the wall was there, people thought, well, it's safe to build landward, I'll put a road there, I'll put more houses, and then it falls over. Then you have the rubble in the water and you have to build a new wall, new and bigger wall. Meantime, with that erosion that hits the face of the vertical wall, you lose your beach, because all that now, that energy that could have dissipated gently over the beach now is like full force coming in at this wall and takes out all the fine particles like sand, so you end up with no beach. Well, this is a favorite picture from Irene. I'm afraid you saw the other direction of this picture, but there were so many seawall failures in Fenwick that year. The seawalls were undermined. They weren't, part of it is probably that they weren't properly supported landward because they weren't designed by an engineer or designed properly, but it was a significant storm. Water got behind them because it splashed up over them and took out the backfill, took out all the support, and it just fell right over, imperiling the houses on the landward side. And here's another example of seawalls undermining because of that force of the water acting on the vertical face of the seawall. This was taken during Irene in Clinton, I believe, looking east, and you can see that example of what happens when these waves that are filled with energy come crashing into a vertical surface, and they're projected up over the wall and into the houses, and then they take out the backfill and the seawall fails. And in some cases, removal of the backfill landward of the seawall exposed septic systems and other infrastructure that aren't supposed to be exposed. The other thing that vertical seawalls do, for example, is prevent tidal wetland from establishing close to them because of the turbulence of the water hitting the wall. Putting a seawall so close to shore also prohibits tidal wetlands from migrating landward, which they're going to need to do as sea level rises. In this case, what would happen if this wall wasn't there and people allowed wetland to grow into their yard? They could cut it, by the way, without even a permit, without even telling us, as long as they don't pull it up. And many times people do mow grass, mow tidal wetland grass. It's okay. But that's when you want to live that close to the shore, you really should be aware of the resources and welcome them coming into your yard. Here's another example of where the low marsh is going to go first. That's Spartina alterniflora, which is low marsh. And of course, as sea level rises, that's going to be drowned. That will be drowned if it can't move landward, which it can't because of the seawall. Here's another example. A bad thing that seawalls cause is that the energy hitting the wall takes away the sand. So what you end up with is a very narrow beach. This is White Sands Beach in Old Lyme. The red line is in 1880, and erosion started there. And sometime in the 50s, those 3 groins were put up, and they haven't really been successful in staving off erosion. And in this case of this groin over here, which is the way that people get over to Griswold Point for anyone that likes to birdwatch. And this perspective isn't really accurate. I took this one right after Irene. There is such a significant drop in the beach sand on the west side from the east. That groin is keeping so much sand from going over there. It's about a 5-foot differential. You have to actually climb down the groin to get to the other side where Griswold Point is. And that's an example of how it can cause adverse impacts to beaches. This is in Madison. If you see the red line on the left, those are 3 houses that were installed landward of our jurisdiction without a bulkhead, and there was a nice beach there. But then probably at some point the people, I don't know why, decided to build a seawall, and it was landward of our jurisdiction then. Then what it did was it caused erosion so much that the right side is now the situation in this location. And it's caused the erosion of the beach in front of it. Now these 3 houses are bulkheaded around in front along the sound and extending into the upland, and that's all that remains between them and the sound. So it's really, and it's because this bulkhead caused all this erosion. You can see how much beach was there before. These 3 here, only one remains. The one over here, they moved back into the dune. Not the best place to put something because we like dunes, but it's at least landward. The middle one has fallen into the ocean, which is pretty bad. And yes.
If that seawall, you're saying causes the beach to erode on both sides?
Yes, it can cause. It really can cause erosion, not just of what's in front of it, but it causes swirling effects right around the side of it, and it can cause damage to not only in front of your property but lateral properties too, which is why these things can be of concern to neighbors because it can really impact them.
That's a significant difference to the right.
It's unbelievable. And I've done permitting for that one, and that's how I happened to notice it when I was looking at the aerials, and I thought this would be a good example for today because this is what we're talking about. It really didn't help them, and it made it worse. Here's an example where this was after Irene or I think it was after Sandy. This is looking east, and the houses on the east side of this groin hardly have any beach, yet the sand is really piled up on the western side of the groin just because of the nature of groins and the fact that it's a little too high. If it was lower, it would allow more sand to go over it. But in this case, what one of the non-structural solutions we're doing here is we just permitted a whole bunch of sand to be brought in here. And it should help protect these houses. There are other drawbacks in addition to the ones I talked about of shoreline armoring. They're extremely expensive. I think, at least I haven't heard too many quotes because really we don't get involved much in the cost of things, but 20 years ago someone told me that steel sheet pile bulkhead costs $1,000 a linear foot, and that was a long time ago. If you want to hire someone to do, you have to hire engineering, somebody to design it properly and do the plans and do the permitting, and then you have to hire a contractor. and they're not permanent. People think, oh, if I spend all this money, at least it'll protect my property, but as we've seen, maybe it won't. And they're not permanent. They need costly maintenance. You might have to rebuild it every couple of years. It may fail. It can reduce storm damage protection. What I mean by that is, like in the case of that Clinton seawall where the water projects over it, it isn't really helping. If you elevated your house, for example, and let the waves pass harmlessly underneath it, it would be better than hoping that the seawall will protect you, only to have it focusing energy and allowing these waves to come over the wall and into your house. It can imperil infrastructure, like I was saying. It doesn't always protect the side slope of a road or whatever you're trying to protect. And divert stormwater and waves onto other properties, like I was pointing out in the Madison case. And it creates a false sense of security, these structures. It makes you think you're protected, and we've just seen too many cases where you're really not protected by them. So what can we do? Well, there's low impact alternatives that we've talked about a lot today. If you possible, move the structure away from the shoreline. But the way that the shoreline is, most of it, even if you have any area in back of where your house is now, it's usually pretty low lying. So that may not be a solution. Elevating houses seems like a great solution. I'm sure it probably might be expensive initially, but it should be a one-time thing. If you build it above the FEMA standards or in accordance with FEMA recommendations, it should allow enough area underneath that the waves will just break under the house. And remove hard structures where possible is a great option where it's feasible, as we talked about today, and implement natural shoreline treatments where it's appropriate. Here's an example of right after the storm. That was Sandy. They said, we're going to elevate our house. And here's an example during the storm where the waves are coming under the house and it seems not to have disturbed the houses at all. One really great option is to allow dunes where you have the room. So many dunes, I really don't know the statistics, but it must be just almost all of them are gone from Connecticut now because people built their houses on them. Or I had one case of maybe 20 years ago in Old Saybrook where someone had a condo in back of a dune, a beautiful dune system, and it was blocking his view from his patio, so he removed it. And we couldn't do anything about it from a regulatory perspective because it was above our jurisdictional line. But that's an example of where education is important. What dunes can do, they again serve as a source of sand, but they also serve to protect what's behind them and mitigate flooding and mitigate the damage. There were cases in, during Sandy. The governor of New Jersey noted where there were dunes, there wasn't as much damage to properties, for example. In this case, the dune is protecting a railroad, but there's many other things dunes can protect, like homes, if you build your homes behind there. And there's definitely states where they do require that. Now here's an alternative of a vegetated shoreline. My colleague coming next will be talking about that. And here's one that it's expected that the intertidal vegetation will colonize naturally, and they'll probably have to do some plantings on the slope because it's kind of steep. But in the case of this other one, this one will probably, that's a mat, a erosion control mat that the likely regular vegetation will just colonize and move landward and serve to secure the slope. And it's so important to keep your property intact because it's your property, and this is a natural way to do it that's cheap and can be as permanent as, and effective, more permanent and effective than something structural that you think would be permanent and effective. And here's core logs. These are coconut fiber logs, and they were successful in establishing vegetation behind there. So thank you very much.